Hello and welcome to Ambassador's lesson on logical fallacies. Today we're going to be talking about different types of logic and how it can be used to enhance critical thinking in the classroom. And we're going to be talking about not only the 24 most common logical fallacies. Welcome to Ambassador's lesson on logic. That was fun, background noise. And we're going to be talking about how knowing these logical fallacies can help our students make the most of critical thinking and public speaking without insulting each other and using their sharpest critical thinking skills. So I'm going to share this link. There's a lot of good articles about logical fallacies. This is a very beautiful poster. You can print it out, spread it around. Logical fallacies are mistakes and flaws in reasoning. So a very common type of logical fallacy is a straw man argument, where you misrepresent someone else's argument to make it easier to attack them. By exaggerating, misrepresenting, or completely fabricating someone's argument, it's much easier to present your own position as being reasonable. But this type of dishonesty serves to undermine honest, rational debate. An example is after Will said that we should put more money into health and education, Warren responded by saying he was surprised that Will hates our country so much that he wants to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. We also see this a lot of times where instead of attacking someone's entire argument, people might focus on the weakest part of their argument, and these are called straw man arguments, where it's an extreme. You can, like an extreme version of a straw man argument is where you pretend somebody said something that they didn't say so that you can argue that. And the example here is that Will is being accused of wanting to leave our country defenseless, which is not what wanting to put money into health and education represents. That's also another type of logical fallacy, which is a false comparison, which we'll talk about soon. So another common one is a false cause. Your logical fallacy is a false cause. You presumed that a real or perceived relationship is the one that causes the other. So another good example I saw of this is cancer causes smoking, which we know is false, but that's getting something backwards. Many people confuse false correlation, things that happen together in sequence, for causation, that one thing actually causes the other to happen. Sometimes correlation is coincidental, or it may be attributable to a common cause. An example, pointing to a fancy chart, Roger shows how temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, whilst at the same time the number of pirates have been decreasing. Thus, pirates cool the world and global warming is a hoax. And thank you, Panda, for interrupting art class. Okay. So another common logical fallacy is an appeal to emotion. Instead of making a well-reasoned, logical, deductive debate, you try to manipulate people to get an emotional response in place of a valid or compelling argument. And that's not to say that emotions aren't part of persuasive speech. Yes, they are. And in much of the real world, it's more important to be persuasive than to be logical. Appeals to emotion include appeals to fear, envy, hatred, pity, pride, and more. It's important to note that sometimes a logically coherent argument may inspire emotion or have emotional aspects. But the problem and fallacy occurs when emotion is used instead of logical argument to obscure the fact that no compelling reason exists for one's position. Everyone bar sociopaths is affected by emotion. And so appeals to emotion are very common and effective. But ultimately they're flawed, dishonest, and tend to make one's opponents justifiably emotional. And we really want to watch out for these in class, because a lot of times people get personal. Students will get personal and make attacks on somebody, and and that's something we're really trying to avoid. So by explaining what an appeal to emotion is and telling our students, hey, watch out for these. This is not good practice. Like, don't insult each other, for example. and it's good to give them the logical background. This is a fun one, the fallacy. You presume that because a claim has been poorly argued or a fallacy has been made, that the claim itself must be wrong. So a lot of times when people are talking, they might say something quickly or have a slip of the tongue, and it might not be exactly what they mean, but it doesn't undermine the whole argument. So I like to argue against the strongest arguments possible. So if I think somebody didn't explain something clearly, I'll say, do you want to repeat your argument so that you can make it clearly? And if I say something too quickly and someone says, but you said this, I'll say, yes, I said that, but that's not what I meant. So please give me another chance to explain what I meant without making this fallacy. So the example is recognizing that Amanda had committed a fallacy in arguing that we should eat healthy food because a nutritionist said that it was popular. Elise said, therefore, eat bacon double cheeseburgers every day. So I don't quite understand that example so well, but sometimes people make mistakes in their arguments in what could be, otherwise, a strong position. So disqualifying somebody's argument because they made a mistake is a fallacy in and of itself. So here's one that I see all the time, the slippery slope fallacy. You said if we allow A to happen, then a Z will eventually happen too. Therefore, A should not happen. The problem with this reasoning is it tends to avoid engaging with the issues at hand and instead shifts the attention to extreme hypotheticals because no proof is presented to show that such extreme hypotheticals will in fact occur. This fallacy has the formative appeal to emotion by leveraging fear. In effect, the argument at hand is unfairly tainted by unsubstantial conjecture. An example is Colin Closet asserts that if we allow same-sex couples to marry, the next thing we know, we'll be allowing people to marry their parents, their cars, and even monkeys. This is a slippery slope argument. We see this a lot in politics, and I hear this a lot, in context of today's political situation with judicial reform. Because there's judicial reform, we're worried that people's rights are going to be stripped away down the line. Now, it's not to say that a slippery slope can't eventually happen. As we saw in the United States of America, people were concerned about a rollback of female rights, and we saw that this did happen. So it's not to say that a slippery slope doesn't have some merit, but it's not in and of itself is a logical fallacy, but consequences do occur, so it's not something that can be dismissed as totally improbable. So ad hominem attacks. You attacked your opponent's character and personal traits in an attempt to undermine their argument. Again, we see this one a lot in politics. I don't want to get too far into politics, but I do want to keep this out of the classroom. I do want to keep this out of discussions that I'm having. And if I'm having a conversation with somebody and I say something they don't like and they attack me personally, that's usually when I end the argument. I usually say, okay, we're not here for a pursuit to truth. You're making attacks on me. You're insulting me. I don't know if I'm going to be able to have a logical argument with you because you're resorting to insults. So ad hominem attacks can take the form of overtly attacking somebody or more subtly casting doubt on their character or personal attributes as a way to discredit their argument. The result of an ad hominem attack can be to undermine someone else's case without actually having to engage with it. We say that, the truth, despite its source, that regardless of who says something, is it true or not? And it doesn't depend on who said it. And this is a tough one because sometimes people we don't agree with, people we presume are enemies, or someone who we have historical animosity towards, might have something important to contribute scientifically, logically, philosophically. And it's easy to say we don't like that person, so what they're saying can't be true because they don't have good virtues. Well, it's not a logical argument. This one is also very important to explain to your students because a lot of times they get very passionate in class when discussing things, and they'll start to attack each other, and we really don't want that. How do we say this? Tu quo key. You have avoided to engage with criticism by turning your back on the accuser. You have answered criticism with criticism. Literally translating as you two, this fallacy is known as the appeal to hypocrisy. It is commonly employed as an effective red herring, another logical fallacy, because it takes the heat off someone having to defend their argument and instead shifts the focus back on the person making the criticism. An example, Nicole identified that Hannah had committed a logical fallacy, but instead of addressing the substance of her claim, Hannah accused Nicole of committing a fallacy earlier in the conversation. So that's kind of like what I said before, when somebody, doesn't explain their position so well, and you say, but you said this before. Well, maybe they did do that, but you haven't addressed the substance of what they're trying to communicate. Personal incredulity. Because you have found something difficult to understand or are not aware of how it works, you made out like it's probably not. Complex subjects like biological evolution through natural selection require some amount of understanding before one is able to make an informed judgment about the subject at hand. This fallacy is usually used in place of understanding. An example, Kirk drew a picture of a fish and a human, and with effusive disdain asked Richard if he really thought we were stupid enough to believe that a fish somehow turned into a human being through just like random things happening over time. I would say that memes are very good examples. Political cartoon are very good examples of personal incredulity, where very complex subjects and difficult things to understand with multiple points of view are made to seem like, oh, you can't really believe that because that's stupid. And this is why we need to do a lot of research sometimes before we enter into topics. Like a lot of times people misrepresent other people's beliefs or other religions' beliefs to make it easier to attack. So that's something we do want to avoid. Special pleading. You have moved the goalpost, also known as goalposting, or made up an exception when your claim was shown to be false, another type of hypocrisy. Humans are funny creatures, and we have a foolish aversion to being wrong. Rather than appreciate the benefits of being able to change one's mind through better understanding, many will invent ways to cling to old beliefs. One of the most common ways that people do this is post-rationalization of a reason, also known as goalposting, which is changing the goal once somebody has reached it. You say, well, that's not really what I meant, and you move the goal. One of the most common ways that people do this is post-rationalize a reason why they thought to be true must remain to be true. It's very easy to find a reason to believe something that suits us and requires integrity and genuine honesty with oneself to examine one's own belief and motivation without falling into a trap of justifying our existence, of seeing ourselves and the world around us. It's very hard for people to admit they were wrong. It's a good lesson to tell our students is, knowing when you don't know something and knowing when to say, I don't know, instead of making up an answer, you can just say, I don't know. And that's a very acceptable way to be open to more information and to be able to listen to other people. An example is Edward Johns claimed to be a psychic, but when his abilities were tested under proper scientific condition, they magically disappeared. Edward explained this, saying that on the one hand, to have faith in his abilities for them to work. There's a funny YouTube trend right now of martial arts masters who claim to have special superpowers, and you can see them in videos with their students, and they're like doing this, and they're like moving their hands, and they're not touching their students, but their students are flying around the gym like they're getting hit by Superman. And then somebody's like, I'm going to debunk this person. And like a boxer will go, a professional fighter will go, and they'll get in a fight with these martial arts masters. And even the martial arts master will be surprised that their technique doesn't work. And they'll say, oh, you didn't believe in what I was doing, which is a whole other can of worms. But we see this and we think like if somebody can't be convinced by the agreeable standard of proof, maybe they're not looking for the truth. So it's something we have to watch out for. Oh, I like this one. Loaded questions. You ask a question that has a presumption built into it, so it can't be answered without appearing guilty. The common example of this is, how often do you beat your wife? And it's like, whoa, if what's the answer to that? I've been presumed to now that I beat my wife. I'm not even married, I don't even have a girlfriend, and you're asking me how often I beat my wife. Like, what is the answer to that? You're presuming that I'm guilty, and you're making me have to defend myself. Loaded question fallacies are particularly effective at derailing rational debates because of their inflammatory nature. The recipient of the loaded question is compelled to defend themselves and may appear flustered or on the back foot. This can also take the form of yes or no, do you agree with me? Anytime somebody says yes or no, and they say, answer my question, yes or no. Okay, so this is a loaded question, and I say, hang on a second. The complexity of my opinion can't be contained in yes or no, and I refuse to answer as a yes or no because that's not my opinion. But that's a common example of a loaded question, of forcing someone into a limited number of answers when it's not black or white, it might be gray. So the example is, Grace and Helen were both romantically interested in Brad. One day, with Brad sitting within earshot, Grace asked in an inquisitive tone whether Helen was still having problems with her drug habits. Ooh, that's a good way to cast suspicion on her. What drug habits? Now if she says, what drug habit? I don't have a drug problem. Well, you're just in denial. And now Helen is on her back foot, and now she has to defend herself. Burden of proof. You said that the burden of proof lies not with the person making the claim, but with someone else to disprove. The burden of proof lies with someone who is making the claim and is not upon someone else to disprove. The inability or disinclination to disprove a claim does not render that claim valid, nor give credence whatsoever. However, it is important to note that we can never be certain of anything, so we must assign value to any claim based on the available evidence. And to dismiss something on the basis it hasn't been proven beyond all doubt is also fallacious reasoning. I remember, so a good example that happened in my life was a philosopher said, everyone does everything anybody does is fundamentally selfish, and you can never disprove this wrong, because you can look at even generous acts of charity as, that's really somebody is doing this charity because it makes them feel good. This is a theory that cannot be disproven. So it's not really a theory at all, because a theory must have conditions that it could be disproven. So if it can't be disproven, it's not really a theory. It doesn't make it right or wrong, it makes it something else. But it's also known as, in Western democracies, in justice, we say innocent until proven guilty. And the burden of proof would be guilty until proven innocent. And we see this again a lot in politics. Prove to me you didn't murder this person. Well, give me evidence that I did. Like, we can't just go around saying like somebody's dead, you killed them. And I go, I didn't kill them. I didn't do it. It wasn't me. Well, prove that you didn't do it. Well, actually, give me evidence that I did do it. So the burden of proof is important. Bertrand declares that a teapot is, at this very moment, in orbit around the sun between Earth and Mars. And because no one can prove him wrong, his claim is therefore valid. So that's a good example. It's a very good example. Ambiguity. You used a double meaning or ambiguity of language to mislead or misrepresent the truth. Here we go. Politicians are often guilty of using ambiguity to mislead and will later point out they were technically not outright lying if they come under scrutiny. The reason that it qualifies as a fallacy is that it's intrinsically misleading. In debates, in policy, in formal arguments, we like to ask people and students to be specific. What specifically do you mean? I teach a lot of Model UN, and in Model UN, we ask students to propose a list of solutions in order on how they want to solve a specific problem. That means, what quantities are involved, how many people are involved, what timetables are involved, how long something will take, what are the quantifiable things that you have to be really specific on. Our common question is, if you have enough food to feed 1 million people for a year, how will you distribute it? A very ambiguous answer would be, we'll give it to hungry people, which is opposite of, we'll divide the food into 12 monthly installments and deliver it to a poor, the poor city, the slums of Rio de Janeiro, and we'll have a whole plan on when the deliveries will be made and who is going to take receipt of them and how we're going to qualify people and all of those specifics. So ambiguity is the opposite. When are we going to do this? Oh, we'll see. We'll do it later. We won't give a solid remark. And it's important to note that being ambiguous, it does mean that you're technically not lying. So it's got some use. When the judge asked the defendant why he hadn't paid his parking fines, he said he shouldn't have to pay them because the sign said, "Fine for parking here." So naturally, he presumed that it would be fine to park there. Double language, fine meaning okay, or fine meaning paying for a mistake. So that's kind of funny. Sometimes it happens, especially if you're a foreign language speaker and people like to mess with you and tell you to say things that are kind of fun. The gambler's fallacy. You said that runs occur to statistically independent phenomena, such as a roulette wheel. This commonly believed fallacy can be said to have helped create an entire city in the desert of Nevada, USA. I mean, Las Vegas. Though the overall odds of a big run happening may be low, each spin of the wheel is entirely independent from the last. So while there may be a very small chance that heads will come up 20 times in a row if you flip a coin, chances of heads coming up on each individual flip remain 50-50 and aren't influenced by what happened before and aren't influenced by what will happen after. An example is red came up 6 times in a row on the roulette wheel. So Greg knew that it was close to certain that black would come up next. Suffering an economic form of natural selection with his thinking, he soon lost all of his savings. So this one is also a psychological problem where things that aren't linked are given weight that maybe because something happened the previous time, something's more likely to have the next time. And I think this is a very common thing that we feel emotionally, like, it's my turn next, I'm due for this, I'm about to get lucky. And it's an emotional response, but it's not logical. Bandwagon. You appeal to popularity or the fact that many people do something as an attempted form of validation. The flaw in this argument is that the popularity of an idea has absolutely no bearing on its validity. If it did, then the earth would have been made itself flat for most of human history to accommodate this belief. Another example of the bandwagon phenomenon is looking at someone who's successful in business, who's made a lot of sales, and saying, wow, what a great idea, because this person's made so much money, they've got so many customers, they must be successful. Look how popular they are. Well, making a sale, making money is external validation and doesn't, it's nothing intrinsical to the idea itself. It's saying because other people have bought into this idea, it must be true, it must have validity. We saw this a lot with cryptocurrency and other Ponzi schemes in history, where everyone saw it's going up, so they assumed that there must be something intrinsically real about it, and they bought into it. And so that's an interesting example. Another interesting example of a bandwagon um, are how many people come out to support something. Like, look how many people are here. There's so many people here that they must be right. They must have a point. So like when your sports team is doing well and people are all of a sudden fans of the sports team, we say they're jumping on the bandwagon. An example is Seamus pointed a drunken finger at Sean and asked him to explain how so many people could believe in leprechauns if they're only a silly old superstition. Sean, however, had a few too many Guinnesses himself and fell off his chair. It's a weird example. But if everybody believes it, does that make it right? And we know, no, it doesn't. But it's very persuasive, very emotional. When people are all jumping on the bandwagon, it's exciting. There might be something to it. Not everything is logical. Oh, I like this one. The appeal to authority. You said because an authority thinks something, it must therefore be true. What is true is a lot of times we do appeal to authority, to professionals, when their skills are relevant. We go to a doctor who's a professional medical person because they are an authority on the subject. And if you have a brain tumor, you want to go to an expert on brain tumors. You want that authority. But they're not always valid. It's important to note that this fallacy should not be used to dismiss the claims of experts or scientific consensus. Appeals to authority are not valid arguments, but nor is it reasonable to disregard the claims of experts who have demonstrated a depth of knowledge unless has a similar level of understanding or access to empirical evidence. However, it is entirely possible that the opinions of a person or institution of authority are wrong. Therefore, the authority that such a person or institution holds does not have any intrinsic bearing whether or not their claims are true. So, especially in philosophical arguments where there is no clearly defined right or wrong, it's easy, authority has more authority. But that doesn't mean that authority is necessarily correct. Example, not able to defend his position that evolution isn't true, Bob says that he knows a scientist who also questions evolution and presumably isn't a primate. Another example of this that we encountered was the vaccine conundrum. All of my life, every baby that I've ever, known got a vaccine at a hospital. Okay, it was never controversial. Then all of a sudden, when vaccines became public consciousness, all of a sudden everybody, had an opinion on vaccines and were quoting different authorities on both sides to try to strengthen their opinion. It was a very strange time in history where the appeal to authority didn't mean anything because everyone was appealing to both sides or dismissing both authorities. Composition division. You assumed that one part of something has to be applied to all or others, part of it or that the whole must apply to its part. Often when something is true for part of it, often when something is true for the part of it does also apply to the whole or vice versa. But the crucial difference is whether there exists good evidence to show that this is the case. Because we observe consistencies in things, our thinking can become biased so that we presume consistency to exist where it does not exist. Example, Daniel was a precious child and had a liking for logic. I said that wrong, didn't I? He reasoned that atoms are invisible and that he was made of atoms and therefore was invisible too. Unfortunately, despite his thinking skills, he lost the game of hide and go seek. It's interesting. No true Scotsman. You made what could be called an appeal to purity as a way to dismiss relevant criticism or flaws of your argument. In this form of faulty reasoning, one's belief is rendered unfalsifiable because no matter how compelling the evidence is, one simply shifts the goalposts so that it wouldn't apply to a supposedly true example. This kind of post-rationalization is a way of avoiding valid criticisms of one's arguments. An example, Angus declares that Scotsmen do not put sugar on their porridge, to which Lachlan points out that he is a Scotsman and puts sugar on his porridge. Furious, like a true Scot, Angus yells at him that no true Scotsman sugars his porridge. And we see this a lot to defend people's side of things, where they say, you're not really like this if you did this, because if you were like this, you wouldn't have done that. So you're not that. It's a very, very common. It's a lot of times with double standards. You know, these people do this and it's okay, but when those people do this, it's not okay. So it's an appeal to purity. If it's not exact, where it's maybe even an over definition. Like if you don't fit exactly within the narrow parameters we've defined, we're dismissing your claim. Genetic. You judge something as either good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or whom it came from. This fallacy avoids the argument by shifting the focus onto someone's origins. It's similar to an ad hominem fallacy in that it leverages existing negative perceptions to make someone's argument look bad, without actually presenting a case for why the argument itself lacks merit. An example, accused on the 6 o'clock news of corruption and taking bribes, the senator said, we should all be very wary of things we hear in the media because we don't know how unreliable the media, can be. So we have this a lot, like, hey, I accuse you of being corrupt, but you can't, and he would say, you can't trust me because who am I? I exaggerate things and you can't rely on me, but it doesn't address the actual questions. It's again close to, I thought it was good that it tied it into being close to an ad hominem. It's close to an ad hominem argument by attacking someone else's character. Oh, this is a good one. Black or white. You presented two alternative states as the only possibilities when in fact more possibilities exist. This is my yes or no. Do you think that, everyone has the right to life? Well, what about murderers? You think murderers should also have the right to life? Well, maybe sometimes we should have a further discussion. I don't know if that's a great argument, but that's the yes or no thing. Black or white, there is no gray. And some people, really think it's either black or white. For me, my favorite color is gray because I like that it represents all of the complexity when things, aren't just true or false. Also known as a false dilemma, this insidious tactic has the appearance of forming a logical argument, but under close scrutiny, it becomes evident that there are more possibilities than either or choice that is presented. Binary black or white thinking doesn't allow for the many variables, conditions, and contexts in which there would exist more than just two possibilities. It frames the argument misleadingly and obscures rational, honest debate. Whilst rallying support for his plan to fundamentally undermine citizens' rights, the supreme leader told the people they were either on his side or they were on the side of the enemy. And I do recall a time in American history when one of our presidents said, you're either with us or against us. And that precipitated a very difficult time in American history and a lot of violence, directed outward. But that was a classic example of you're either with us or against us. Begging the question, you presented a circular argument in which the conclusion was included in the premise. The logically incoherent argument often arises in a situation where people have an assumption that is very ingrained and therefore taken in their minds as a given. Circular reasoning is mostly because it's not very good. The word of Zorbo the Great is flawless and perfect. We know this because it says so in the great and infallible book of Zorbo's best and most truest things that are definitely true, and should not ever be questioned. Um, there's a lot of people who take their ideas that they have to be right, and then they have to adjust all logical arguments into supporting that narrative. Appeal to nature. You argued because something is natural, it is therefore valid, justified, inevitable, good, or ideal. Many natural things are considered good, and this can bias our thinking, but naturalness itself does not make something good or bad. For instance, murder could be seen as very natural, but that doesn't mean it's good or justified. I really like this example because a lot of times people do point like, oh, it's natural, people, it's not like human rights and ethics. Treat people like, a lot of times you ask people like, for a non-metaphysical reason that ethics are universal. Why is killing wrong? Well, a lot of times people will say killing is wrong because of the golden rule. You should do to others what you want them to do to you, because that's how people naturally want to be treated. But it ignores the law of the jungle, which is the strong survive. So it might be natural for people or for things to happen, but that doesn't mean it's good. That doesn't mean that we should give in to our instincts. That doesn't justify people, behaving, oh, I can't help myself, I'm just like this. And you'll hear this a lot. People will say, I can't control my temper because I'm like this, and my people are like this, so I have to do this. So appeal to nature in human society is not acceptable in terms of justifying ethics. An example, the medicine man rolled into town on his bandwagon offering various natural remedies, such as special plain water. He said it was only natural that people should be wary of artificial medicines such as antibiotics. Some people get very into health, and I don't want to get into that one. Anecdotal. You used personal experience or an isolated example instead of a sound argument or compelling evidence. Very common. What happened to me must be an example of how things happen everywhere and statistically relevant. I saw one time a French person behaving like this, so all French people must behave like this. This is a very common one that we encounter with our students, so it's very important that we explain to them this is how prejudices form, and not to buy into them. It's often much easier for people to believe someone's testimony as opposed to understand. Sorry, what?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Can I, when we say an argument, can I say researchers that I read or researcher that we found, something like that? Because we always find research that will say something that we argue about.
So that's good. So that would be quantitative scientific measurements, having numbers, having facts, having specific information. Researchers have done studies and found that 97% of French people like cheese.
Yeah, okay.
Versus I met a French person who didn't like cheese, and they said their entire family didn't like cheese. So therefore, French people don't like cheese, because my story about a French person who doesn't like cheese happens, isn't statistically backed up. So it's good to understand. And sometimes personal stories like, look, if I would say 100% of French people like cheese, and you would say, well, no, I met a French person who doesn't. Like, now I know your statistic is manufactured. So it's not to say that an anecdote isn't ever right, but it's not the best way to make a point.
Okay.
So quantitative scientific measures are almost always more accurate than personal perceptions and experiences, but our inclination is to believe that which is tangible to us and or the word of someone we trust over a more abstract statistical reality. Oh, here's an example involving me. Jason said that it was all cool and everything, but his grandfather smoked like 30 cigarettes a day and lived until 97. So don't believe everything you read about meta-analysis of methodology. Sound studies showing proven causal relationships. Somebody lived to their old age and they smoke cigarettes. Okay, should we, like, does that mean it's healthy? It's also an example of a false cause. We're getting to the bottom of our list. The Texas sharpshooter. You cherry pick the data into a cluster to suit your argument or found a pattern to fit your presumption. How many market studies, how many scientific analysis, how many lines are drawn on a piece of paper that, go up or down? Basically, data can be manipulated to show whatever relationship we want to show. So we have to be careful because it's often being presented to support an agenda. This false cause fallacy is coined after a marksman shooting randomly at Barnes and then pointing a bullseye target around the spot where most of the bullet holes appeared, making it appear as if he's a really good shot. Clusters naturally appear by chance, but don't necessarily indicate that there is a causal relationship. An example, the makers of sugarette candy point to research showing that 5 countries where sugarette drinks sell the most units, 3 of them are the top 10 healthiest countries on the earth. Therefore, sugarette drinks are healthy. So it's a fun one. The middle ground. You claim that a compromise or middle point between 2 extremes must be the truth. Just a second. Whew. I'm going to sneeze in a second, so excuse me when I do. Much of the time, the truth does indeed lie between 2 extreme points. But this can bias our thinking. Sometimes a thing is simply untrue, and a compromise of it is also untrue. Halfway between truth and a lie is still a lie. An example, Holly said that vaccinations caused autism in children, but her scientifically well-read friend Caleb said that this claim has been debunked and proven false. Their friend Alice offered a compromise that vaccinations must cause some autism, not all autism. That's a really good example of halfway between something that, it's not true. It doesn't hold up. We know that some things are right and some things are wrong. Okay, so that was great. I'm going to go back to the top and we're going to look. These are not all of the logical fallacies, but this is a great poster that has them all written out, the ones we went over, and it's a very good distributable to classrooms to help guide them for the next step of an exercise where they can actually go into and debate each other. So I'm going to stop the live right now. Thank you everyone for tuning into the live, and I'm going to